Hello, this is Darren DePaul, the voice of Emperor Valkorion, and you're watching another video by Vulkk.
Greetings folks, I'm Vulkk. Today's topic is class balancing and how exactly does that work. How is the combat team of engineers from Bioware Austin doing that for Star Wars The Old Republic? And more specifically, what are they planning to do for patch 5.3 and 5.4, the summer update for Star Wars The Old Republic? If you follow the yellow post or the developer posts on the official forums, you might have seen a very long text yesterday from Eric Muscu really detailing the combat team's mechanics and priorities for balancing the DPS in this case. They're only specifically talking about DPS in this article because they say that they have the healers and tanks in one group listings, which I don't think is very right to say. They don't mean what they say, so I think it's a little bit misleading. Never mind. The very beginning of the article, we will see basic terms which are really helpful for every beginner MMO player: DPS, HPS, nerfs, buffs, and things like that. So, why are they doing this? As we know, in 5.3 and 5.4 this summer in Star Wars The Old Republic, they are doing another batch of class balancing. They usually have to do that every time there are new abilities, utilities, and level caps introduced into the game. This happened last November in 2016, and since then, none of the classes has seen any significant improvement or nerf or any rebalancing whatsoever. So this is about to happen in 5.3 and 5.4 in July and August for many of the specs, not for all. How exactly are these things being done? Bioware was very gracious to give us what they call damage grouping categories. We're specifically going to discuss here the DPS. They have a very specific set value for how much damage the classes are supposed to say. They give an example in this very same article with 10,000. This is not their real goal, but let's use that 10,000. So we have a whole bunch of disciplines performing in a different way: melee, ranged, burst, sustained, dot, in between. And all of these are supposed to be measured somehow. So Bioware tests and develops a target DPS number, and they start splitting the DPS disciplines according to that number, giving priority to melee sustained DPS dealers. As we can see from the table, these are the dot specs primarily, such as Annihilation Marauder, Hatred Assassin, and so on. They are supposed to have slightly better DPS. As you can see from this table, they're supposed to have 5 DPS better than the global target for the current state of the game, which is level 70 content. The second group has a slightly less advantage compared to the golden target, 2.5%. These are the semi-burst damage dealers, which in this case is only the Fury Marauder or the Concentration Sentinel. They're supposed to be a burst DPS, but not quite. That's why they're called the semi or quasi burst damage. In the golden middle, we've got the melee burst DPS classes and ranged sustained DPS classes. By sustained, they again mean primarily dot specs. Not so much heavy relying on dot are also considered to be sustained. Quick example, we've got the Combat Sentinel as a very good burst spec. Down below, we've got the Engineer Sniper, for example, and Balance Sage. Once again, you know probably if you play these classes even better, you know that not all of them perform as well as they should. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But first, let's finish reading the table. In the bottom half, we've got the ranged semi-sustained DPS dealers who are expected to perform 2.5% less or lower or worse than the golden middle. So this is, in this case, only the Virulent Sniper, Dirty Fighting Gunslinger. At the very bottom, we've got the ranged burst DPS dealers such as the Gunnery, Commando, Telekinetic Sage, and Sharpshooter Gunslinger. Why are the DPS classes split in such different categories and groupings? Here is my treatment. This isn't exactly coming from Bioware, but over the years, they've said bits and pieces here and there, and it is actually confirmed. Melee sustained DPS dealers are the dot spec. Let's take the Watchman Sentinel or the Serenity Shadow, for example. They shine when they're allowed to stay on one target for long period of time. So their dots can actually do most damage and become really useful. However, in most encounters in PvE and in PvP as well, nobody is allowed to stay on the same target for too long of a time. That's why this DPS discipline needs to be slightly buffed. So when actually it's at a disadvantage, melee classes are by default at a disadvantage because melee classes always have to be more careful about uh, circles on their feet, circles around the boss, knockbacks, pushbacks, pulls, and other things like that. Various mechanics that you have or haven't seen yet from Star Wars The Old Republic's PvE and PvP environment. That's why the dot specs are supposed to be, not all of them are currently at the top, but the dot specs and the so-called sustained damage dealer are supposed to be. I'm highlighting Serenity Shadow because last week we received the first preview of one of the disciplines that is going to be changed or balanced for 5.3. This is the Hatred Assassin and Serenity Shadow. I'll link the video and the written article here somewhere so you can go and check them out. They're receiving purely buffs. Several of their passive abilities are receiving buffs to help this discipline perform the way it's supposed to be. Currently, Serenity Shadow and Hatred Assassin are at the very bottom of the DPS table because it's not balanced properly. Why? Probably because of the level cap change or for other various reasons that Bioware will or will probably never share with us. That's not really important. The second group is the semi-burst damage dealers, and Concentration Sentinel is where Bioware expects it to behave, and it behaves the way they expect it to. In the very middle, we've got the targeted DPS group, which is the melee burst and the range sustained. These are the so-called golden middle classes in terms of gameplay and toughness when you play them, because melee burst is really easy to switch from one target to another, which is the vast majority of the boss encounters in PvE, and pretty much a constant appearance in PvP, because you would never be allowed to stay on the same target in PvP for more than just a few seconds, unless of course the player on the other side has fallen asleep. At the very bottom, Bioware has the ranged semi-sustained DPS dealers and the ranged burst damage dealers. These classes are arguably, of course, not everybody will agree, but they're arguably the easiest to play. Not necessarily easiest in terms of class mechanics, but when you're a ranged burst, this means that you have smaller numbers of channeling abilities, thus you have the ability to move around more frequently, step out of red circles, move out of fire effects, and things like that. Just find your spot on the map. Plus, ranged DPS overall has a slight advantage when it comes to PvE and PvP as well, because they stay behind the bundle in the middle usually, and they have a greater view overall the full combat area and the boss arena, if you will. That's why these classes are expected to have a slightly lower DPS performance compared to the other classes. In the pure form of just giving you an example, just because I want to explain it as simply as possible. If you compare Watchman Sentinel versus Gunnery Commando, Gunnery Commando has very few channeled abilities, while the Watchman Sentinel is a melee class that doesn't have burst at all. Gunnery Commando can switch all the time to whatever targets they want with minimal effort, while the Watchman Sentinel will have to perform a number of attacks, abilities, and movements, special movements, in order to get themselves in a comfortable position to do decent DPS. All of these preparation phases are really putting the Watchman Sentinel at a disadvantage. That's why it's expected to be performing by default slightly better than the other classes. How is this being done? Believe me, nobody from Bioware sits and parses from dusk till dawn or vice versa. No, this is all simulated. So they're simulating different disciplines with the exact same tier of gear. So they don't compare tier 1 sniper to tier 4 mercenary. No, that's not happening. They're comparing them versus the same type of a target. So whether it's a boss encounter simulation or a dummy simulation, the comparison is always the same. That's how you can achieve best results and get the most accurate picture of how the class is performing. When you're simulating this, you're minimizing the player error, which always happens, believe it or not. So that's the most simple way I could have explained it. And yes, that's why balancing is required, because, for example, Hatred Assassin and Serenity Shadow is currently at the very bottom, while on the other hand, Gunnery Commando and Arsenal Mercenary are very overpowered, specifically in PvP at the moment. Other classes as well that you can mention from this list, but I don't know if we should really bother with that. That's the idea, balancing all of the disciplines so they can perform according to these tables. If your favorite discipline, let's say the Ruffian Scoundrel, does not perform better than the Saboteur Gunslinger, then it's very likely that Bioware is going to buff it or balancing it in a positive way, as in bolster some of its passive or even active abilities. Something else in the very end, Bioware has officially stated that they do not plan, unless something really exclusively happens, they do not plan to alter too much of the disciplines. Last week we saw the first batch of changes coming to the Serenity and Hatred, and these are just passive boosts to existing abilities. They're not adding new abilities, they're not altering utilities. Utility alteration is something that may happen, they say, but it's not necessary, and that's like a last resort for them. Currently, they all want to just see what would happen. Will the balance be achieved, or as close to a perfect balance as possible? Will that happen if they try to just buff DPS of some classes and nerf DPS of other classes? Now, I have a very weird opinion as to why this statement over here about the groupings for healers and tanks being one. I don't think this is right, or at least they do not say it in the correct way. Not the three archetypes of healers are not supposed to behave exactly the same. No, this is absolutely wrong. You cannot compare the hot-based Scoundrel versus the very, very direct healing coming from a Sage. This is absolutely wrong. What they meant to say is that any 2 healers in an 8-man operation, for example, or any 4 healers, a little bit extending it, to a 16-man operation should be capable of healing the group. However, they are not expected to behave exactly the same. So if you see that in your star parse log, your Scoundrel is parsing, just for an example, 10,000 effective heals per second, and your Sage is parsing at the same time 6,000 effective heals per second, it doesn't mean that the Sage is performing bad. No, it's just a different type of a class. It also means that the Sage is still capable of doing what they are supposed to do. With this, I would like to end this video explanation, overview, tutorial, whatever you want to call it. I've done my best, I think, because I've recorded it twice to make sure that I've explained it the best way I could. Hopefully it was helpful. If it really was, you know what to do. Throw a like onto the video and leave me a comment if you have questions, if you didn't understand something, or if you disagree with some of my explanations. Just tell me, what do you think is wrong or different? And on that topic, which discipline do you think should be next? Which discipline should be buffed or nerfed in the upcoming Friday update? See you in the next video, guys. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the video. Click the like button and help me out. To help me improve and expand, consider becoming my patron with a small monthly pledge.